Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to give a few minutes for the rest of the audience to join us, and we'll get started at 10:02. Hello again, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of Reuters Events Pharma and Healthcare Consultancy Group, or HCG, we're really excited to be doing this session with you today. We're going to be focusing on leveraging neuromarketing principles to enhance HCP engagement. My name is Jal Habib. I'm honored to be your moderator for today. I lead our commercial marketing business here at HCG. And today we're going to be exploring how the principles of neuromarketing can be used to better understand what drives physician motivation. In an era like we're in today, we're overwhelmed with data. We're going to dive into the importance of elevating human centricity and how we connect with healthcare professionals in a more authentic and genuine way. Finally, we're going to dive into the strategies that go beyond traditional marketing and discuss the importance of developing content that not only captures the attention of the audience and resonates, but truly motivates and inspires physicians to make an impactful change at the point of care. I'm very fortunate today to be accompanied by a distinguished panel of experts, each bringing their unique insights and extensive experience to our discussion. I'm going to hand it over to Jeff to get us started on the introductions of the panel, and then we'll dive right in.
Great, thanks, Dial. I'm Jeff Kirchner. I'm a marketing director in the Global Oncology Organization at Merck. My academic background was in social psychology. In a past life, I was a professor of social psychology, and one of my great joys, I think, is taking some of that academic literature and research and translating it into real-world settings. So thrilled to be part of this conversation. Nicole?
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Nicole Luciano. I'm a Senior Vice President of HCP Behavioral Strategy at HCG. My academic background is in neuroscience, where I did some neurobiology research on GABA receptors, but have been in the healthcare marketing industry for 12 years, supporting a range of therapeutic areas, and most recently diving into some of the behavioral strategy behind why physicians think the way they do, act the way they do, and how we can leverage some of their thoughts, feelings, biases to drive behavioral change within the pharmaceutical industry. John?
Thanks, Nicole. And I'm John Timmons, and this topic is really dear to my heart. I've spent the last 25 years or more working on launching trials and products in oncology and thinking with a lot of really great people how you can actually accelerate behavior change so that more patients can get the benefit of physician-patient decisions in the cancer arena. Also, it's important to me because, full disclosure, I've been a patient twice with cancer, first with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, and then more recently with thyroid cancer. So personally, I've gone through what it's like to see physicians in multi-modality teams discussing a patient case, mine and my case, and come to decisions and to see how important it is that everybody's educated and the work that everybody here on the line is doing to help advance care. So really looking forward to hopefully sharing some good insights with you that will help you as you also work in your disciplines. And with that, also I've been working with Jeff and Nicole on Keytruda for the last 10 years across multiple indications. And Maria is a new friend, and I would like to now introduce you to Maria.
Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. I'm Maria Verastegui. I'm the Executive Marketing Director at Acorda Therapeutics. My background comes from design thinking, so really using human centricity to put the human at the center. And really, my fascination has always been in how the the consumer's mind is engaging and thinking about the marketing and the communications and everything that we're surrounding them with our brands and how they respond, and having that design thinking background, both in use in consumer care partner and HCP, has really given me the puzzle pieces to make better communication channels for people so that they can discuss what's truly going on with them, with their disease, and the physician can truly have the information that they need to make the decisions that they have to make about treatment plans. So for me, communication is king, and that's really what I have used my expertise to develop in pharma over the years.
Thank you, panel. We all want this to be a very engaging session for you all on the line. So encourage you to put your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them towards the end of our discussion today. So without further ado, let's dive in. Nicole, can you get us started by setting up the unmet need and the challenge that we're solving for today?
Absolutely. Thank you, Diala. So pharmaceutical marketing has undergone dramatic transformation over the past several years. And with the increasing availability of data and insights about our customers, the future really does hold unlimited potential for how we can understand our customers and personalize our content to drive the industry forward. So thinking about the past, where we've come from, pharmaceutical marketing from 15 or 20 years ago was really characterized by a heavy reliance on traditional methods, print media, face-to-face interactions. And the content was really one size fits all, and there was limited personalization. But as the industry's evolved, the volume of data currently available about customers, about their behaviors, has really increased. This has allowed for increasing personalization of that content. Pharmaceutical marketing has become more targeted, more relevant. Omni-channel deliveries really help drive consistent customer experience for our brands. However, a byproduct of these advancements is that everyone's really doing them. And as a result, our customers are inundated with promotional materials everywhere they look. And while these promotional materials are extremely relevant, this can still be overwhelming for our customers, requiring them to sift through, discern what really matters for their patients and their practice. So in the future, advances in technology, data analytics, and AI are going to yield an overabundance of customer insights for us. But then the ever-increasing number of treatment options available means that we're going to reach a tipping point. Something's going to have to change. So how can we transform our approach to pharmaceutical marketing, both from a content perspective and how we deliver that content to remain effective and relevant? So let's start with where we are today. The digital transformation has offered a wealth of new opportunities for engagement. Our audiences are under tremendous pressure. The rapidly evolving treatment landscape across many therapeutic areas means that they're under constant pressure to stay current with latest data, best practices, but this is on the background of being bombarded by promotional efforts. They've got emails, rep visits, EHR pop-ups, banner ads. And if you combine this with the higher patient volumes, HCP shortages, and increasing administrative demands that they're facing, we're seeing unprecedented rates of HCP burnout. So what can we as marketers do about this? It's imperative that we're delivering content that matters to our audiences. We have to meet them where they are with regard to the challenges that they're facing. We have to simplify our data, and we have to simplify our information so as not to exacerbate their cognitive load and exacerbate engagement fatigue. But most importantly, we have to remember to prioritize the humanness of our marketing. Our customers are people, so we can't meet them with impersonal, one-way content that's delivered at them, not to them. Rather, we have to get to know them as people and understand how our brands can best support them. And our brands can build strong, meaningful relationships with customers through the implementation of behavioral strategy approaches. Behavior strategy leverages expertise from many disciplines that are represented by the folks on the line here: economics, psychology, neuroscience, philosophy. And the goal of behavioral strategy is to harness these customer insights to drive behavioral change. Now, generally, this sort of achieved through a framework of knowing who your customers are, knowing what you're trying to get them to do, and then understand what their reasons for taking action or not taking action are. So neuromarketing is just an evidence-based application of behavioral strategy principles. It aims to look at both the unconscious and the conscious factors that drive this decision-making and behavior. And then by taking the factors and viewing them through a lens of empathy and really thinking critically about how people respond to each other and respond to information, we can gain alignment on what content and what delivery is most going to effectively drive their behavioral change. So practically in the pharmaceutical industry, what does this look like? And it all starts with relationships and influence. Unlike in a lot of other industries where customers, don't have the same consequence of their decision making that is seen in the healthcare industry, treaters have to weigh all the available data and evidence to make the most informed decision based on what's best for each of their individual patients. So beyond the obvious of prescribing privileges, treaters have a tremendous amount of influence and broad influence upon the stakeholders of pharmaceutical marketing. So we know that treaters are taking an individualized approach to each of their patients, but they also view each of these patients differently. So how can we use neuromarketing to ensure that our treaters are having empathy for all of their patients equally, and that each of them are equally receiving the same benefit of the doubt? Based on clinical experience and that of their colleagues, that of their peers, treaters understandably hold preconceptions about different treatments that are available to them. So how can we use neuromarketing to better understand these biases about our brands and our competitor brands and either reinforce them or dispel them? And while treaters do vary in their degree to which they associate treatments with companies, we know that they have feelings about how pharma can either help or hinder their practice. So how can we use neuromarketing to help treaters believe that pharma companies are just as invested in their patients' outcomes as they are? On the flip side, there are levers that can be pulled in the other direction by capitalizing on influences that each of these other stakeholders have on treaters. Patients are data, personified. So how can neuromarketing bring patient stories to life to inspire these behavior changes? Our brands offer so much promise to our treaters and to the patients that they're treating. So how can neuromarketing be used to present data in a way that resonates with them on a deeper level to drive this behavior change? And finally, pharmaceutical companies have to show up as partners to our treaters. So how can we use our neuromarketing strategies to convey a beyond the pill commitment to our treaters? Now, before we dive into the panel discussion, we want to conduct a quick poll to understand your baseline familiarity with and application of neuromarketing techniques.
All right, well, it looks like the majority of our audience, nearly 60%, are unfamiliar and curious to learn more, which is great. You're in the right place. We have about 40% that have dabbled in it and are excited to understand it at a deeper level. All right, so with that, thank you, Nicole, for setting us up with the challenge. We're going to dive into the panel discussion today, starting with Maria. Maria, you saw that with Nicole's intro, she alluded to a lot of these challenges that I think many of us have, and many of our client partners have attempted to solve with heightened precision marketing and omni-channel. but there's still this, reoccurring fatigue that we're seeing with HCPs. Can you allude a little bit on dive into a little bit of the impact of that fatigue for HCPs, both from an in-person engagement perspective and also from a digital perspective?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Nicole and yourself, alluded to that, omnichannel has been helping, and precision marketing to be more improved in targeting, enhance engagement, and making that personalization so that the content is right for that person. But I think that overall, the whole ecosystem of communication needs to be constantly looked at. Like, I wish I could have, the answer. Here's what we're doing that's amazingly successful. What we're doing that has created success is a constant ability to pivot dynamically. And in order to do that, you have to look at the entire ecosystem of your communication. So what you're doing digitally, what you're doing with the field force, what you're doing in advocacy, what the consumer is having. So it's really constantly looking at the totality of your communications, the frequency of them, the cadence, the style. And when I say pivot dynamically, I mean, it's not just turning something off. It's changing the tone of an email, or changing the message and the way it's delivered by the rep, or the empowerment that we're giving our patients to step into the doctor's office, because these are all touch points that are affecting the physician, right? Like how we drive consumers in, how we talk to care partners, how we provide the materials for the physicians, right? Like all those things, print, digital, and otherwise, are all part of that ecosystem. So to me, I love the precision that we can have today, right? The targeting and everything that we're able to do in personalization. However, I think that relying upon that solely and not really taking into account the 360 view of the totality of your communication ecosystem, I think that's where the miss is. And I think that's where we have to continuously, as marketers, you take a pulse constantly, right? Okay, what do we change? Because it's like it's like being a magician of sorts, right? You have to have that right recipe, and that recipe is different for every brand and every segment, that we have.
I think that's a great idea. Like the emphasis on kind of treating it like an ecosystem, I think is fascinating, because I think too often, we're talking about our customers here, but I think we also need to talk about ourselves as marketers. And I think sometimes there are folks who want to think of it as like a checkbox thing. Look at all the promotional materials that I delivered. I kicked them over the fence. I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you just described is the exact opposite of that. This is something that these are living and breathing tools that constantly need to be reevaluated in order to have maximum amounts of success. So I think that's an interesting perspective.
And in continuing to dive into the dynamic need of us being able to pivot depending on those ongoing dynamics, John, can you elaborate for us a little bit on what role can behavioral strategy and neuromarketing entail in overcoming some of the challenges in engaging HCPs to allow for more of that dynamic nature that Maria and Jeff have alluded to?
Great question. I was going to talk a little bit about cognitive load, which physicians are suffering from. And there was a great picture, Nicole, that you shared at the beginning of the physician sort of going like that in this very dynamic environment. I love your phrase, Maria, the dynamic environment, the dynamic ecosystem. I'd love to answer a question about cognitive load, but I'm suffering from cognitive overwhelm because we're about to go to ASCO and there's 5,000 abstracts this year. How do you decide? 5,000 interesting abstracts. So what's great is that we live in a time where medicine is going forward by leaps and bounds and generating new studies and generating new possibilities for patients across multiple diseases. But what do we do in a situation where there's so much information and inside this dynamic ecosystem? And to your point, Jeff, there's a lot of materials being made in this ecosystem. Is that really all we should be thinking about is getting messages and abstracts and information and sales messages and pop-ups out to our target audience. Or what neuroscience is helping us to think about is what happens after you're exposed to a message. So you could think about what's happening with, so maybe sort of omni-channel right now. It's like we have a hose and we're watering grass. There's grass, and that grass, the water is almost evaporating before it actually can hit the grass and nourish the roots and the soil, because maybe we should be focusing on what happens to you when you're exposed to information that you then remember, that you actually remember it. What's the impact of lots and lots of information on you and on your memory? And there's some wonderful work being done in neuroscience on how people actually absorb and remember information, which is marketing, as marketers, is just wonderful resources for us to draw on. And these are things like gap effects. Gap effects is when we pause to let you digest some information, such as that pausing allows you to encode and embed. And Maria, you talked about magicians, and magicians are wonderful to watch and learn from, because magicians play with our memories all the time. They do two things. If they want you to remember something, they'll slow it down and give you a gap to remember it. But if they're doing some dirty work with the trick and they want you to forget it, they have a 30-second window where they will just deluge you with patter and information and you won't remember a thing. And this is, in a way, kind of what we might be doing with omnichannel and with some of our approaches, is deluging people with information and forgetting, how do we get them to absorb? Because if you can absorb the information, then you can remember the information. And then you can talk to someone else in your healthcare system. And you can start to make a change in practice. And really, that's the part that I think neuroscience is giving us a lot of clues in how to achieve actual practice change and motivation by making messages memorable, rememberable, and to be able to act. Sorry, I've gone too long. Love this topic. I'll stop. Hopefully there's a gap effect here and we'll remember this, but I don't know if others have thoughts on this, that it's not just, we spend a lot of time making messages, but how do we get the messages acted on by using the way people actually absorb information?
And John, so much of the effectiveness to be able to ensure that the message is resonating in order for it to be effective or to make it memorable is you have to truly know the audience.
Yes.
And really understand, what is motivating and driving their decision making. It's not just about, evoking emotionally, compelling content that's going to resonate. It has to be something that is true to what is either challenging them in that moment or what's motivating them. Maria, based on your experience, what are some of as physicians are coming in and getting bombarded, and healthcare professionals overall, with so much information, like John was alluding to at ASCO alone, what are some of the key factors in your experience you've seen influence healthcare professionals' clinical decision-making process?
Well, I think sort of touching on all that we've just discussed, and thinking of human centricity, right? Again, borrowing from my background in design thinking, what I often think about is the physician as a person, right? And what drives them, I think, also defines the persona that they are as a physician, right? So if they're a person that wants to, look at the latest cutting edge therapies, and in their practice they have that type of persona too, because also, again, going back to the consumer, you have to have that persona present themselves in the doctor's office, right? It's very important the way a consumer presents themselves to the doctor. If the doctor is looking to use these more cutting edge therapies, the persona of the consumer also needs to match and say, I'm going to be able to withstand what I need to for this, and sort of have that stamina that the doctor can be comfortable doing that. So I think understanding what drives the physician, are they avoiding risk? Are they motivated by seeing real life case studies of how this therapy is impacting life, right? The life of this person. really understanding, is it the data that moves this person, right? What's the combination of those things? Because we all have this ecosystem of tools, as Jeff was mentioning, right? It's sort of like these materials that we've created, and we're successfully pushing them to the customer. But now thinking, how are they absorbing it, right? Like, which one of these pieces are affecting the decisions that people are making, right? Which ones are being more resonant and more direct at what our product does, and really presenting our benefit in a way that says to the physician, these are the patients that you can try this in, that you want to use this in, and giving them that confidence, because our presentation gives the physician the confidence in our therapy, right? And when I say our presentation, it's the Salesforce, it's digitally, it's, through the emails, it's our presence at conventions, right? So it's our presentation that gives the physicians the confidence that they need. But I think the factors that influence a physician, that is also on a, I want to say on a one-to-one basis, but that's deep, right? So at least on a segment basis, right? We need to put our physicians into personas and understand the level of risk, the level of information, the cadence. Maybe they like more in-person communications better than they are receiving digital communications, or there's a combination of it. So I think, again, I'm going to go back to that, being able to dynamically understand the collective factors of our specific HCPs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point about, we have to make sure that we're not only meeting our customers with messages that are going to resonate for, the motivations and biases that they have, but we're also meeting them with those messages in a way that they're able to digest them.
Right.
If you have someone who's willing to kind of go off and explore the latest opportunities and is more information seeking, you're going to engage with that customer in a very different way than someone who's operating more, to your point, in a risk avoidant manner, who tends to kind of remain with their inertia. They suffer from a challenge of entrenched behavior where the amount of information in their ecosystem is too great. So how are you going to work with that prescriber to kind of disrupt that entrenched behavior, ask them to make an incremental change? It's going to look a lot different from that information seeking, curious, kind of innovating HCP that you're talking to.
That's a great point, Nicole, because it's especially when it's in person, and in person seems to be recognized yet again for being so important, and because you can build a human relationship with someone, you can start to understand who they are, especially if you meet with them over time, and you respect the fact that there's that old phrase, always be closing, which just doesn't work. You're actually developing a relationship over time, and you're not trying to pressure them and close them. You're actually trying to truly understand them. And it's especially important if there's a barrier to care, because I think as marketers, we'll get a wonderful data set, and we'll just say, this data set is so good, it is so compelling, it's number one in the guidelines, it's beautifully evidence-based, it's a wonderful study, it should have a great trajectory of uptake. And something happens, maybe with a segment of physicians, or maybe even more generally, where the uptake isn't what we expect, and we can get frustrated. And that's where we as humans have to catch that emotion of frustration and really use it and go, whoa, if we're feeling this frustration, we need to park that and go out and understand what the frustration is with the clinicians who are not doing what we want them to do, that we think will benefit patients. And for any different persona, if you dig deeper and keep digging, you'll find, and you can form a relationship by showing that you understand that they feel a barrier. You don't have to accept the barrier, but you have to show that you understand that there is one, and you want to help understand what it is. By taking that approach over time, you can really get to the root of what that cause is, and then help them to decide whether they want to change it. But that all comes back to what you're saying, Maria. It's really understanding the different types of people that we're dealing with, and their risk aversion, or their relative desire to implement a gain, for example. There's a couple of things in the chat, and I don't want to monopolize this, but I did see that there were 2 questions in the chat. Diallo, is it okay to answer them?
John, we're going to hold on to the questions until the very end to
Thank you.
answer. But yeah, there are some great questions. Keep them coming for those of you on the line, and we're going to get to those towards the end of our discussion today. Part of what we were talking about, Jeff, I'm going to go to you next, is really truly understanding the environmental factors within this ecosystem that are at play in terms of the pressures that our healthcare professionals are under, be it time, resources, workload. How do those environmental factors like impact their receptiveness to the messages or the content that we're relaying, and how can marketers like on this panel and on the line adapt their approach accordingly to address some of those challenges?
It's a great question. And a lot of my work recently has been interacting with surgeons. And step one was really wanting to understand what their lives are like. And I learned very quickly that they have no time. They get up at 4:30, they're in the operating room by 6 a.m. They're on their feet all day in the OR. They have paperwork to do. They have to talk with payers. They have internal meetings, sitting down with new patients. Where in that time is there an opportunity, as John said, to take that gap and to actually think about things? And as Maria and Nicole pointed out, everybody's got an omni-channel campaign. And it may be a really beautiful omni-channel campaign, but if 5 companies are coming at you with one, how does yours sort of stand out? So I hearken back to, I'm going to geek out a little bit here, but way back in the early days of social psychology, attitudes and persuasion sort of research, there was something called the peak technique, which is something that actually just sort of stands out and makes people pause instead of immediately flipping past it or deleting that email. Something that makes them, it strikes a chord, it resonates, it makes them want to learn more. I think we need to do more of those kinds of things. Anybody who took sort of an introductory social psychology course back in the day, you might have remembered, goes by different names, you might have heard people talk about systematic versus heuristic processing, or central versus peripheral, you name it. And that's, I think, what we're all trying to do. And it's an interesting Venn diagram, I think, where there's neuroscience, there's marketing, there's social psychology. And then I really like what Maria said, where there's design thinking that comes into play too. What we're really talking about is the intersection of all 4 of those things. But when John was talking about cognitive overload, again, we've been talking about it on the part of our customers. I think it also applies to us. I would bet dollars to donuts that everybody out there listening to this webinar, I don't think anybody would say that they have plenty of free time in their day to sit there and think about some of these things, right? And how do I apply it? So part of it is we need to start with ourselves and think about how we can actually design these things intelligently and really take into account what our individual personas out there as customers, what they specifically need. Maybe one other thing I would mention here that becomes a challenge for us is, I think in a lot of our disease areas, it's now become more common, I think, to see multidisciplinary teams. That's great, because different expertise is coming to play in the treatment of the patient. But that also makes it very challenging for a marketer, because you have different customer types, each with very, very different needs. A thoracic surgeon needs something very different than a medical oncologist does, who needs something very different than a pathologist does. And so when we do all these, I think Nicole said it earlier, one size fits all. Is that ever a great idea, by the way? No. And so I think it tends, though, to make us feel like we need to do our work in triplicate. Or we need to create 3 different messaging platforms, or 3 different differentiated communication strategies for these different customers. So while overload is happening for our customers, it's also happening for us too. And I want to make sure that we are mindful of that as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Jeff. I think one of the things that I've seen that potentially helps that internal marketer fatigue is one foundation that is a commonality and unique experiences or communications that are selected based on that segment's preference, right? So like if we decide that there's a specific segment that really loves the rep triggered emails, right? We specifically create personification for that, personalization for that, so that's a differentiating point. Because to your point, we can't do all of it. I mean, that would be, we'd have to have like an omni-channel mind. I don't even know what that would look like, right? But anyway, that's been the recipe that I've seen that's worked, is like something is a commonality, and then there are discrete things that are created based on that segment's preferences.
Good point.
think that's
Maybe if I could make one more comment. I'm sorry, John.
Yeah.
Going back to that, elaboration, likelihood model, systematic versus heuristic. There's actually two dimensions to that. One is the motivation piece, and I think we've been spending a lot of time talking about that. Like, how do we get folks motivated to want to process our message or process what we're trying to say? But that's all for naught if the second piece isn't there, which is the capability. And that's where I was going to with the MDT or the different customer personas too, because this message may have really got this surgeon thinking, this is something I should really pay attention to. But then when they click on it, like, I don't understand any of that.
Right.
I don't have the requisite knowledge to process what's going on here, or it's just too much, or I don't have, this will take me 15 minutes to read through this email and I have 5. So I guess I would encourage all of us to think about both pieces, like try to stimulate the motivation piece, but also make sure we're meeting them where they are in the capability piece as well.
I think there's a downstream, I hate that word. I don't know why I used it. I wanted to connect the patient to this discussion, because in the specific sort of example you're citing about MDTs, when you're a patient and you are faced with conversations that you hear maybe only one at a time sequentially, so a conversation has happened without you in the room between 3 or 4 people who are each experts in a specific domain. It has involved you. It may be the most important conversation of your life, but you weren't there for it. And then as you go through your experience with these different clinicians, you're going to hear the output of that conversation in pieces. You're going to hear part of it from a surgeon. You'll hear part of it from an oncologist. You'll hear part of it from a radiation oncologist. And I've had this. And you'll hear your feeling, and this is so important for us to understand at the end of all the work we do. As a patient, your feeling about the decisions that are being made when you're not there, and you're then basically being asked to weigh in on one at a time, your feeling is highly colored by how consistent the story is across the different practitioners and how precise the language is. And it is a really, and I think, so how do we help shape that? What does that mean for us? If we accept the premise that patients who are given more consistent information across specialists, and it's more precise and specific, that helps the patient, then that means that as we tell our stories to the different clinicians, we have to be thinking about consistency. We have to be thinking about how what we're saying might get translated. And we have to become incredibly precise in understanding the power of words. It can be the difference between 3 or 5 words that are uttered by a physician that make a patient feel either this is a good idea or a bad idea. And it's very simple. And this is part of neuroscience. Some of the studies that are being done on how you frame things. If you frame things as an equivalent choice, actually the person becomes confused. Your intent might be that you want to be unbiased, but the person is confused. If you actually make a firm recommendation and feel you can stand by it, the person is more likely to say, okay, I will go explore that and I will take that on board. But its precise language is so important.
I love that we're diving now into a little bit more of the direct application of behavioral strategy and some of our marketing principles. And I know we definitely, as a panel, as we got together, wanted to make sure that our audience today is able to walk away and be able to apply some of those learnings right out of the gate as they move forward. So let's pivot I'm going to pivot to you, Nicole, for a minute. Can you provide some examples of some of these neuromarketing principles that we've alluded to thus far? How they were used to address a specific challenge on a brand?
Yeah. Well, I want to say, I know we're kind of coming into this from from an academic and a practical level. And I would want to level set by saying a lot of times people are applying neuromarketing principles and strategies to the work that they're doing unconsciously. It's not something, we want you to do it consciously and we want you to do it with a sort of thoughtfulness, but just inherent in marketing, there is neuromarketing involved because that's what's going to be a more effective message. One example for how we applied some of these neuromarketing principles is, back in the day, we were working on a drug for NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Now it's MASH. So it tells you how long ago the name of the disease has changed since this work. So this isn't a new disease, but it's one that had never really had any potential treatment options at the time. And there was a real lack of clarity and a lack of alignment among treaters and the terminology for what you would consider an appropriate patient for screening, diagnosis, staging of the disease, because everything was very interventional and invasive. There was just a lot of overwhelm and confusion in the treatment space. And the company that we were working for had justifiable and significant concerns that if they didn't properly position themselves with, diagnostic criteria and recommendations for screening, how that they were going to position themselves in this space, their treatments would be relegated to sort of watch and wait because that's what had been done up until that point, or sort of lifestyle intervention, or kind of getting lumped in with management in the type 2 diabetes realm, which are, a comorbid condition of NASH. So what we did is we worked with a panel of KOLs, we worked with a panel of treaters or would-be treaters for NASH to really understand what would drive them to treat, what would drive them to screen or not. And it actually, Jeff, ties back really closely to something that you were just talking about, this idea of capacity, motivation, and opportunity. When we were discussing and testing epidemiology terms with them, using these, inflammatory, for lack of a better term, terms like looming crisis of NASH or an epidemic of NASH. These were certainly accurate. This is a huge patient population, and these terms are obviously impactful, but not in the way that we wanted them to be. These words touched on our audience's motivation. They definitely were like, oh my God, if there's a looming crisis, something needs to be done about it. It certainly touched on the opportunity. There are clearly a lot of patients, but where it didn't land was their capacity. It was overwhelming. It instilled in them a sense of helplessness. It is such a big problem. There's nothing we can do about it. We can't even begin to scratch the surface. When we pivoted and actually used some of less incendiary language to talk about NASH, if we talk in a more data-centric way about the urgent medical need and the downstream, I know you hate that word, John, the downstream consequences of not managing the urgent medical need. If we talked about it medically as a serious condition, chronic condition, progressive, that gave the folks that we were talking to something that they could grab onto. It put a tool in their toolbox and it made it feel less intimidating for them. And it drove them to feel like that they were able to action on it, both as treaters, potential treaters of the disease, and referrers for the disease.
Thanks, Nicole, for walking through that example. I'm also keeping an eye on the chat. People are definitely understandably wanting to get into a little bit more of the meat of how they can apply some of these principles. So Jeff, I'm going to go to you next as we continue this discussion on the application, direct application of some of the behavioral strategy principles. How can companies today drive organizational change to enhance the adoption of some of these strategies?
It's a good question, and it can feel like a hurdle, an insurmountable hurdle at the outset. But I think there are ways to do it if we sort of chunk it out appropriately. I know a lot of people feel the pain of what it's like to do anything different at all from a medical and legal review standpoint. That can be one of the most painful parts of our daily existence. But I think there are ways that we can show those medical and legal reviewers that we can do things in a very compliant fashion. Just using principles of neuroscience doesn't mean that we're doing something that becomes out of bounds. So I think that's always maybe step one, is getting folks on board, getting a critical mass of people on board that can potentially throw up a roadblock to some of our efforts. I did take a sneak peek at some of the questions. I did see that there was a question about, specifically like KPIs. And the way I've always approached KPIs has also been influenced by a social psychological background, meaning there's a sequence to it. And I think that attitudinal change happens first. And it's sort of a leading indicator of some of the behavioral changes that we'd like to see. I know some people tend to view attitudinal changes as being soft metrics, but they tend to be really, really powerful, I think, in predicting future behavior. So I love, whether it's in an ATU or some other sort of quantitative metric, is getting regular feedback on what their attitudes are toward a particular message, towards a particular product, or toward some of the actual dimensions that are part of our neuromarketing strategies. And then you can get some of the quote unquote harder metrics coming a little bit later when you think about open rates and all the traditional kinds of metrics that we have. Again, I do tend to think you see a correlation between some of those earlier attitudinal sort of changes and then their behavior in terms of more of the traditional metrics as well. And then I think, we talked as a group. I think there's an opportunity to trial this in companies that are a little bit open-minded. Start small, do some pilot programs. I think, John and Nicole, I know you've taken the principles of influence from Robert Cialdini, and have tried to just start small with some workshops with some sales and marketing folks, just to start to institute some of these principles. And you see that, first of all, it's actually a really enjoyable experience to try to do something new, to try to integrate some of these principles into what you do in your daily work. And then when you get to see that it actually pays off, you get to see that people respond to you differently as customers. They're more willing to have a give and take in the sense of they feel like they're being heard, so they want to hear you out. May give you a little bit more time, maybe more willing to prioritize you when there's 3 people out there in the waiting room. You're the one that gets to see them first and get more time with them. You're building that relationship. So again, when it goes back to KPIs, I would encourage to be some short-term, but also some long-term KPIs that come into play as well. Any other thoughts on that from our panel?
Yeah, I think that it was well said, Jeff, that I know that people are looking for specific things, and we're trying to dance around the fact that we work on proprietary stuff with clients. And sorry for everyone out there, because we are dancing a lot. I think I'm glad you brought up Cialdini, because he's very public domain. Here he is. Guys, if you really want something concrete, something really great in here. And we found that by taking these lessons from social science, to Jeff's point, and starting to understand customers, and really what Cialdini did was he was able to identify and label things that we all feel as human beings, like social pressure, or that we tend to be very committed to a specific point of view. And we would encourage you to read the book and think about it. But by having a framework that actually is rooted in a proven methodology, and being able to go and work with people like yourself and others and have the methodology and start to explore, how could we adapt this to our situation, and can we do it ethically because we have great data sets, responsibly, and make sure that what we don't do is, while we're all in the business of influence, we're not manipulating. Because that was one of the questions in the chat as well, about credibility and authenticity. I think one of the assumptions we made coming into this conversation was that we're speaking to you when you have a really, really excellent data set, and you may be having some difficulty with it getting traction for whatever reason. but I think that's a good example. Another example is Kahneman recently passed away. His book is a magic book, the book Thinking Fast and Slow. If you're looking for things that you might want to try in the pharma world, he's got all kinds of heuristics that you can take, to Jeff's point, into a small pilot group and start to try out availability heuristics, recency biases, things like that, risk aversion, which Maria talked about earlier on. These things are all available to you, which is a testimony to the kind of time and the time we live in, where so much research is being actually made understandable and usable and practical. So I apologize to all of you for doing the dancing that we're doing. But we do have, there are a lot of really great techniques you can start to pilot, as Jeff says.
Thank you for that, John. In continuing to answer the questions from the chat, Maria, I'm going to go to you next. There's a question here about how does some of the strut marketing principles that we talked about today relate to virtual promotion? How important is emailing in this strategy?
Well, emailing, I would say, if done, when done, with the proper cadence and the proper personalization of the content, I think is important because it reinforces whatever the in-person communication has been, or, potentially the Congress or exhibit experience has been. So I firmly believe that, that email campaigns, really email communications at large, really help to reinforce and reiterate communications. Also, start to present potentially some new ideas, right? So it helps with the redundancy of the information. There's one question that I'm itching to answer.
Yeah, please do.
It's sort of very logistical, but I love conferences. And someone's asking about neuromarketing in Congress and professional engagements. So I think you could very easily apply neuromarketing at your Congress, at your exhibit, by observing behavior, right? You can, if you're RFIDing your booth, then you know who's coming into your booth, you know how much time they're spending, making sure that, if you've got screens people are engaging with, the reps that are at your booth, you have to note the human behavior that's happening there, so that you can see, all right, 50% or 60% of attendees, gravitated towards the information that really talked about, the safety or the efficacy, or they liked playing the game in the booth, or whatever that is. That gives you a sense, as to what's the human behavior, because ultimately that is what neuromarketing is, right? It's the study of the brain's activity, the emotion, the cognitive response that people are having to what we're putting in front of them. Now, there's actual neuromarketing techniques. You could do eye tracking. Like there's many different sort of tactical measurements, but there's also the ethnography of it, the human observation of it. So that is what's more easily applied for us as marketers, right? Because we're in the environment, we can observe what's happening, we can ask what's happening, and then we can use those insights to feed our next actions for our brands.
I think that's well said, because that's why I was kind of mentioning that Venn diagram earlier, or the intersection of neuroscience, marketing, social psychology, and design thinking. Because just having information that somebody's P300 lit up at a certain message, that doesn't tell you that this message is the best thing. What it tells you is there's something there. And maybe it elicited some sort of connection to a patient outcome. And that's the piece that you actually really want to action. But if you're just kind of focusing on the gadget, or just on the tech that's coming in, it's wonderful, but it's a tool, it's an input. And I think we need to be much more comprehensive when we're thinking about neuromarketing as opposed to neuroscience.
Yeah. And I think, Jeff, that ties in really nicely to another question we received in the chat about, is it worthwhile to segment HCPs according to their learning preferences? I think, we can view a lot of the things as tools, these neuromarketing techniques as tools. I think a lot of the way that traditional segment is done by prescriber behavior is another tool. And that a lot of this, all these tools tell us what a prescriber is doing, but they don't provide any insight into why they're doing that. So I think, doing these segmentations by things like learning preferences, by categorizing their motivations and their capacity, and some of the sort of more traditional social psychology techniques that we talked about earlier, that provides you a mechanism and a framework to act upon them, as opposed to just using this data that's swirling around. How do you synthesize it into something that's meaningful and actionable? And that's where really neuromarketing takes us to the next level.
And to segue from that, Nicole, there's a beautiful question by Kim, which I think we really should answer. How important is it for marketers to get in the field in front of customers to understand the human behavior component? And the answer is, there's nothing more important. And we can give you a concrete example here. We've been talking a bit about emotion. We never got to empathy, really. I don't think we used the word. We didn't use the word about emotion, and having emotion as part of what you're trying to communicate to customers and getting the emotion right. We would never have learned this, and I think it's okay to share this, if we hadn't had a face-to-face interaction with a physician who observed that because of Keytruda in lung cancer, he was writing fewer death certificates every day. Now think about that for a moment. That's part of an oncologist's job, is to actually sign off death certificates. He noticed the impact that it was having on him and his patients because he was signing fewer. This person is then sharing with you that you have the right as a company to an emotion about what you're doing. You can't learn that. How do you learn that without actually talking to a human being, going out and learning what their day is like, what their experience of your product is like, what it means to their patients, and then hearing something like that? It's a moment where everything stops, right? Time stops when you hear something like that.
Thanks for that, John. We have time for maybe one more question. The one I want to field to the panel and jump right in is, what are some new innovative HCP marketing tactics that you've seen?
Well, I don't know if this is new, but it's something that I like to think of as doing new, and doing think tanks. So having a physician think tank and having a consumer think tank, and really fielding the questions to both sides to see how each is responding, and then gathering those insights, having our agency partners and internal marketing teams work on that, and having them present back to the think tank. So it's kind of like co-creation, right? In a way, it's old school maybe, in that you're going back to that face-to-face, right? Where we could potentially be using AI to generate that stuff that would add the innovation. But the real genuineness, I think the innovation is in the communicating and bringing these two different audiences together and titling them a think tank. Because it's not a market research group. It's specifically created and crafted to think through the problems and the solutions that we need to have for better human connection, better human communication. To me, that felt new.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I would add, in a similar vein, I think systems-based approaches to marketing are really informative. And what I mean there is not necessarily to think about our customer as an isolated node. They're connected to multiple different people within a system. That could be at an ecosystem sort of level. It could be within a relationship. I mentioned the MDT analysis a little bit earlier, but I think we're finding that individual attitudes, proclivities, desires, they can sometimes get thrown out the window depending on the strength of the system that they're in. And so it helps you direct where your marketing efforts would be most effective. Maybe it's not at directing it at the individual, maybe it's directing it at the institution, or it's directing it to fix what the protocol of the treatment pathway is in that institution, rather than someone's individual behavior. To use Nicole's example, if you look at just a simple behavioral spreadsheet on secondary data for prescribing, you may see two individuals that have 80% brand share. One of them could be because I love the product, it's the best thing since sliced bread. The other one could be it's because my hands are tied. I hate the product, but it's the only thing that's actually available within my institution, those you can't market the same way to those two individuals. So I think a systems-based approach, again, maybe it's not the newest, maybe it's not the sexiest, it doesn't have the words AI in it. But I do think some of those things are really useful when you're developing new marketing techniques.
Well, thank you for that, Jeff, and thank you to the panel that facilitated this really robust and insightful discussion. I hope to those of you on the line, you've taken something from this, whether it's a moment to deep dive into the topic or to optimize what you have currently. Thank you again for your time, and hope that we inspired and motivated you to apply different marketing strategies as you move forward.
Thank you.